Good evening. I'm Judy Woodruff. On the NewsHour tonight, Haiti in crisis. New details raise more questions about the assassins who killed the country's president. Then, the fight for Syria. A critical vote in the UN Security Council decides the fate of the country's last humanitarian lifeline.
As aid workers, we demand the international community separate human rights work from politics and to avoid attaching policy gains to the distribution of humanitarian aid.
And it's Friday. David Brooks and Karen Tumulty examine the withdrawal of U.S. troops from Afghanistan and the latest on the New York City mayor's race. All that and more on tonight's PBS NewsHour. Police in Haiti have now arrested 17 men in connection with Wednesday's assassination of President Jovenel Moise. Authorities say 2 are U.S. Haitian citizens and 15 are Colombian nationals. 9 suspects are believed to be still at large. The U.S. is sending federal law enforcement officers from the FBI and Homeland Security to help. We'll get the latest after the news summary. Search crews have pulled the remains of 15 more victims from the rubble of a collapsed condominium tower in Surfside, Florida. That raised the confirmed death toll to 79. 61 people are still unaccounted for. The Miami-Dade mayor said they are working as expeditiously as possible to locate more victims.
This recovery is moving forward with great urgency as we work 24 hours a day on the pile to recover victims and bring closure to all of the families still waiting. We want to bring them news as quickly as we possibly can.
Workers were also able to find a cat who had lived on the building's 9th floor and survived the collapse and reunited it with its family. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention today encouraged schools to reopen fully now that students as young as 12 are getting vaccinated and that deaths are declining. It also said that fully vaccinated teachers and students do not need to wear masks while in school. Meanwhile, the CDC and the Food and Drug Administration said fully immunized Americans do not currently need a booster shot. That comes after Pfizer announced plans to seek approval for one in the next month. Tropical storm Elsa, that is, triggered flood warnings across the northeastern U.S. today as it barreled into New England. In New Haven, Connecticut, water was seen spouting from manhole covers. And in the New York City region, downpours flooded subways and streets. President Biden today pressed Russia's President Vladimir Putin to take action to disrupt ransomware attacks emanating from Russia. The leader spoke for an hour by phone in the wake of a string of cyber attacks linked to Russian hackers that paralyzed U.S. businesses. Mr. Biden warned that the U.S. will, quote, defend its people and its critical infrastructure. President Biden also signed an executive order today aimed at curbing the anti-competitive practices of big businesses. It includes 72 actions and recommendations to boost wages and increase consumer protections. Before a signing ceremony at the White House, the president said the order targets abusive actions by monopolies.
Capitalism without competition isn't capitalism. It's exploitation. Without healthy competition, big players can change and charge whatever they want and treat you however they want. And for too many Americans, that means accepting a bad deal for things that you can't go without.
Business and trade groups opposed the order, arguing that it would hamper the post-pandemic economic recovery. The Biden administration also announced U.S. immigration authorities will no longer detain most migrants who are pregnant or recently gave birth, reversing another Trump-era policy. Immigration and Customs Enforcement officials said the decision reflects their commitment to treating individuals with dignity while still upholding the law. In Bangladesh, at least 52 people are dead after a fire broke out in a food and beverage plant outside Dhaka. First responders worked to put out the flames and recover bodies after the fire engulfed the 5-story building Thursday night. Fire officials said the main exit door was locked, trapping many inside. The Taliban now claim to control 85% of the territory in Afghanistan. While that's impossible to verify, their fighters have made strategic gains in recent months as American troops pull out of the country. Taliban leaders have promised not to attack provincial capitals. Back in this country, the city of Charlottesville, Virginia, announced plans to take down its controversial monument to Confederate General Robert E. Lee tomorrow. The statue sparked a violent white supremacist rally in 2017 that left a woman dead. A nearby statue of another Confederate general, Thomas Stonewall Jackson, is also set to come down Saturday. Workers began removing the security fencing that remains around the U.S. Capitol today. The 8-foot-high fence was erected after the January 6th insurrection. It's been in place for 6 months. The operation is expected to take about 3 days to complete. And on Wall Street today, banks and tech stocks led all 3 major indexes to notch record closes. The Dow Jones Industrial Average climbed 448 points to close at 34,870. The Nasdaq rose 142 points, and the S&P 500 added 48. Still to come on the NewsHour, COVID cases continue to strain hospitals in areas of the U.S. with low vaccination rates. The UN Security Council decides the fate of Syria's last humanitarian lifeline. New analysis shows climate change driving extreme heat and drought in the western U.S., plus much more.
This is the PBS NewsHour from WETA Studios in Washington and in the West from the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism at Arizona State University.
As we've been reporting, Haiti is leading an international investigation into the assassination of President Jovenel Moise. John Yang has the latest.
Judy, the investigation is generating as many questions as answers. The 15 Colombian nationals under arrest are former members of that nation's armed forces. 11 of them were captured after breaking into the Taiwanese embassy in Haiti. Meanwhile, the political storm is intensifying, with competing prime ministers claiming the right to run the country. After Moise was assassinated, Prime Minister Claude Joseph announced a 15-day state of siege. But a new prime minister appointed by Moise, Ariel Henry, was supposed to have taken over that very day, and he says he's the rightful ruler. To help us try to sort through this, we're joined by Pamela White, a former U.S. ambassador to Haiti, and Gary Pierre, the founder of the Haitian Times, a newspaper serving the Haitian diaspora. Thanks to both of you for joining us. Gary, I'd like to start with you. Haitian officials have arrested these 17 men. They say that they're responsible, but they say, as often said in political assassinations, it's not important who pulls the trigger, it's important who pays for the bullet. Given President Moise's service in office, does that give you any clues as to who may have paid for this operation?
Well, we don't have a clue right now because there are many people who you can say would be involved in something like that, obviously. It's not just one. But one of the things I want to rule out is that this was not political. It's not a political hit. It's a personal hit akin to a mob hit. So this was about business. He had, encroached on the interest in a lot of powerful forces in Haiti, and unfortunately, I think this is what got us there.
Ambassador White, there is a new election, a presidential election, constitutional referendum scheduled for September. The United States position appears to be that it should go forward. Do you think that's a good idea?
No, I really, really, really don't. I think, unfortunately, for many years and many places around the world, the United States government thinks an election is the answer to a very complicated problem. And this is very complicated in Haiti. Anyone who's not Haitian who says they understand Haitian politics is probably lying. And even though I've spent 5 years of my life when I was a junior officer and 3 years of my life when I was ambassador in Haiti, I don't claim to be an expert either. But I am pretty certain that free and fair elections are not going to be able to take place in the current atmosphere in Haiti. It is too violent, it's too chaotic, and there is not any support from the players that are integral to making it happen. So I don't see it.
Gary, I mean, talking about chaos, competing prime ministers. Are we in for, and if there is no election, are we in for a prolonged period of unsettled political situation in Haiti?
I don't think so. I think the UN has made it clear that they are supporting Claude Joseph as prime minister, as they announced yesterday, and it's up to him now to build a government and try to move forward. The UN seems to be willing to work with him, and I want to say that I agree 100%, and it was refreshing to hear Ambassador White made a comment, because exactly, the US has been forcing this democracy on Haiti. We need to go at it. The institutions that need to be germane to a democratic society are too weak, so we need to really not push the same game. And really talk to the stakeholders in Haiti, people who want to make this place truly a democracy. Because that's why we come back here every 5 to 10 years talking about the same thing. We want to force this democracy. Now, I am an American, I'm a Haitian American, I love democracy, but we have to be real. You know, at what point are we in this process to make sure that Haiti, when it becomes truly democratic, can remain a functioning democracy?
Ambassador White, I want to continue on that. I mean, the United States seems to only pay attention to Haiti in times of crisis. The Aristide coup, the earthquake, this assassination. You have President Trump deriding Haiti as, shall we say, not a pleasant place to live. There are also comments from Senator Biden from 1994 circulating. Let's take a listen to that.
If Haiti, a god-awful thing to say, if Haiti just quietly sunk into the Caribbean or rose up 300 feet, it wouldn't matter a whole lot in terms of our interest.
So, Ambassador White, is this an opportunity for the United States to reassess its policy toward Haiti, and what should that be?
I absolutely think it is. And I think every time we look at Haiti and we see turmoil, except, in terms of huge crisis, but the last 3 years have been disastrous. Not one of my Haitian friends, not one, hasn't had someone in their family or circle of friends be murdered in the last 3 years. Not one of my Haitian friends hasn't had someone that they know kidnapped. I mean, the place has descended into chaos. You can't. So what are we going to do about that? The elephants in the room in Haiti right now are two security questions: food security. A third of the country is starving; they're hungry, and physical stability, security. You can't have an election when people are being murdered. There's no way to get to people to the polls. There's no way of even identifying who should be going to the polls. This is craziness. And then the other one is the COVID.
Well, Gary, on that point about security, the United States says the FBI is going to go down to help investigate the assassination, but there are also reports that Haiti wants U.S. troops for port security and other internal security. Do you think that would be a good idea?
I don't think so. In fact, I wrote a column this morning that asked for the Biden administration to send in the FBI, because I think that's a good thing. But soldiers are another thing. The Haitian police force can provide such protection. We don't need U.S. forces there. It evokes too many bad memories, and people just don't want that. It's not the thing to do. I do believe that they need help. I mean, the Ambassador White knows this. The State Department had a great program with Haitian American police officers working in concert with the Haitian police. That program was working well until President Trump dismantled that program. That was really unfortunate. And so there are mechanisms in place that the State Department, has in place to help. It's not necessarily the Defense Department. It shouldn't be the first default move. I think state is better placed to handle the situation politically, and they can. And we just have to make it a priority.
Gary Pierre of the Haitian Times, Ambassador Pamela White, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
The CDC's guidance for schools to fully reopen this fall and to allow fully vaccinated students to go without masks is yet another sign of how the U.S. is shifting its approach to the COVID pandemic. But even as the push for regular routines grow, the Delta variant presents its own risks, especially to those who aren't vaccinated. Some states in the South and the Midwest have low vaccination rates. Stephanie Sy looks at one dealing with a spike in cases, Missouri.
Judy, Missouri is one of those states where the Delta strain is leading to a rise in cases. It's among the top 5 states when it comes to new cases and hospitalizations. Missouri has reported nearly 7,600 newly confirmed or probable cases in the past week. Fortunately, the number of reported deaths remains low, only 7 confirmed in the past week. But there are regions, particularly in the southwest part of the state, where vaccination rates are well under 35 or 40%. Hospitals in those areas are grappling with serious illness and a strain on resources. Eric Frederick is the Chief Administrative Officer at Mercy Hospital in Springfield, Missouri, joining us now. Mr. Frederick, thank you so much for being on the NewsHour. Describe what you're seeing at your hospital and how it compares to the height of the pandemic last winter when many hospitals around the country were overwhelmed.
Yeah, thank you, Stephanie. I appreciate you having us on and giving us this opportunity. I was looking at the numbers earlier, and just to put it in perspective, we have 2 surges, one last year and now the current one. Mark this current surge starting on June 1st, where our inpatient census for COVID was 26, and today we're at 128, which is the highest census we've had the entire pandemic. So 39 days to go from 26 to 128. Last year, our peak started on September 1st. It took us 150 days to make that same escalation. So it's alarming to have your patient census with COVID grow that fast over such a short period of time. We've had plans in place the entire time, but the ability to deploy that plan even faster than we did last year is where that strain came on our resources over the last couple of weeks.
Well, let's talk about that, Mr. Frederick. What shortages, if any, have you experienced to care for these new patients? I understand that having enough ventilators has been an issue.
We certainly strained our ventilator resources last week, and we pushed them to the edge. We have a number of ventilators that we keep on hand, and with some additional resources like transport ventilators should we have to move patients. Our plan allows us then to reach out across our ministry. Mercy is a pretty large system with multiple hospitals, and part of our plan is to be able to lean on our sister facilities for some of their resources should we need them. And so we saw a rapid escalation from Thursday through Saturday, and we really pushed right up against our on-hand inventory right up until we were know that we were going to be utilizing that last ventilator. We pulled that part of our plan out and quickly rallied some resources, and they were delivered on time. So the good news is we never had a gap where we had patients that needed resources we didn't have, but we had to act pretty quickly, and luckily our plan allowed that to happen. As of today, we have plenty on hand for this continued rise, and we can get to more if we need it.
What about ICU capacity, staffing shortages, or any of those issues at this point?
Yeah, so from a bed capacity, we've got beds. We have stretched our ICUs. During the peak last year, we really had one dedicated ICU for COVID patients. This year, what we've found is we have to stretch into a second. So we're really looking at 2 dedicated COVID ICUs, and then we have a 3rd ICU that we have for those non-COVID patients. And actually, it just stood up a 4th ICU. It was a closed unit that hadn't been utilized in a while, so we stood that back up for some flex capacity as well. So that takes additional resources, equipment, other beds. We have multiple COVID units for different acuities of patients. So those that are less sick but still have COVID can be moved around the hospital. But you hit on it, ultimately it's a staffing issue, right? So I think we hear a lot from people that say we've got plenty of beds. I've had people in the community say, how can you be stretched and you have 800 something beds? And people, I think, don't realize that beds are not just beds. There's specialized beds. There's behavioral health beds. There's pediatric beds. And when you really get down to the number of beds you have to care for this type of patient, it's not all the beds you see on the license that's hanging on the wall. And so, and then ultimately what it comes down to is do you have the staff to put around that bed? And that's what really, you can have all the beds in the world. And if you don't have the nurses and doctors and technicians, then you can be in a bad spot.
Well, I'm glad you have the staff, but I did read that there are a lot of patients in the ICU. In fact, I saw you tweet more than 80% of them are on ventilators, a lot of severe COVID cases you're dealing with. Out of those cases and deaths, Mr. Frederick, are those all unvaccinated people?
Yep. So definitely the percent of ICU patients on ventilators is alarming. I think it was 88% is what I had counted the other day. Today, we're a little bit lower than that, but still above 80%. That's not what we saw last year. It was usually around 40 to 50% of our ICU patients were on ventilators. I will say, as we keep toll of who is vaccinated in-house and not, what we're seeing is less than 5% of our patients are fully vaccinated. And none of those patients to date have ended up in the ICU or at the highest level of care. So even though there may be some that are vaccinated, the numbers are pretty low, and they usually end up in our lower level of care, recover and go home. I'm not aware of any that have died in our facility at this point.
Eric Frederick at Mercy Hospital in Springfield, Missouri. Mr. Frederick, thank you for your time.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Today, the UN Security Council voted unanimously to extend a crucial aid operation for Syria one day before it was set to close, after a deal between the U.S. and Russia. The White House said that President Biden and Vladimir Putin discussed it on a phone call. But as Nick Schifrin reports, some humanitarian groups say the deal doesn't go far enough for the millions of Syrians in desperate need.
For Syrian children near the Turkish border, the only way to survive is to search through scraps. 10-year-old Mohammed Adi begins every day at dawn. If he finds enough pieces of steel, he can eat.
I collect and sell steel I find here so that I can afford to buy a loaf of bread. There's no one that can afford to spend money on us. We have to work so that we can spend what we earn on ourselves.
The children live here in the nearby Al-Amo camp. In northwest Syria, desperation is everywhere. Thousands of Syrians who have come here after fleeing their homes say all they have left is God and the United Nations. For the weathered and the weak, whose houses were destroyed by airstrikes, this arid camp is now home. Fahmi Al-Saud says if the last humanitarian aid crossing had closed, everyone would have turned to the trash, not to trade steel, but for food itself.
If they close the border, where will people go? They'll go to the landfills. If they find fruit scraps, they will eat them. They will eat out of starvation, that level of starvation.
In 2014, the UN Security Council approved 4 humanitarian border crossings into Syria. In January 2020, Russia used a veto threat to close 2 crossings. 7 months later, under pressure from Russia and China, the UN closed a 3rd crossing, leaving only one, Bab al-Hawa, in the northwest. Today's agreement extends the status quo for 6 months, with a 6-month renewal that a senior administration official called virtually automatic. The UN praised the deal, and U.S. Ambassador to the UN Linda Thomas-Greenfield said the unanimous vote saved lives.
It's a moment for millions of Syrians who will not have to worry about starving to death in the coming weeks. It's important that the United States and Russia were able to come together on a humanitarian initiative that serves the interests of the Syrian people.
But humanitarian aid groups say authorizing a single aid crossing isn't enough to meet the vast need. And they say Russia's blocking another proposal that would have reopened a second crossing shows disregard for Syrian lives. Today, Human Rights Watch said Russia has successfully blackmailed the international community. Amnesty International accused Russia of playing political games with the lives and welfare of millions of people. Idlib is the final stronghold of the Syrian opposition. Humanitarian workers in Syria accuse Russia and the Syrian government of using humanitarian need for political gain.
As aid workers, we demand the international community separate human rights work from politics and to avoid attaching policy gains to the distribution of humanitarian aid.
But Russia and the Syrian government want the aid to pass through government-controlled areas. Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov recently blamed Syria's humanitarian crisis on the U.S.
If we're all worried about the humanitarian problems of the Syrian people, we need to look at the full range of reasons, starting with sanctions, the illegal seizure of Syrian assets and foreign banks at the request of Washington, a total robbery.
85% of Idlib's 4 million people depend on the Bab al-Hawa crossing, and now it's also COVID. This week, the World Health Organization said the U.S. is counting on the crossing to deliver more than 50,000 vaccines. Last weekend, 8 organizations demonstrated at the crossing and accused the Russians of killing them through bombing and starvation.
This decision would subject people to another form of killing, like the bombardment we experience every day from Russia and the regime.
Despite today's agreement, that bombardment is relentless. Last Saturday, Syrian government artillery and Russian airstrikes destroyed this home and an office of the Syrian humanitarian rescue group, the White Helmets. The airstrikes killed at least 8 civilians. Most of them were children. Just a mile from the border crossing, Syrian families' fate still rests on a vote from the same country that bombs them. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Nick Schifrin.
Stay with us. Coming up on the NewsHour, why both parties are behind changing one of the ways Congress spends money. David Brooks and Karen Tumulty consider the U.S. role in Afghanistan and the New York City mayor's race. And can you spell history? The remarkable New Orleans teen who won the National Spelling Bee. Extreme heat and drought are baking the western United States and Canada again this week, following hundreds of heat-related deaths in the Pacific Northwest last week. Record-breaking temperatures are expected to return to California this coming weekend, including in the San Joaquin Valley, which is where William Brangham is currently reporting. And he joins me now from the city of Visalia, where, William, you were telling us it's something like 109 degrees, another heat wave coming. Tell us what it's like, and are officials there prepared?
Judy, the technical term is it is unbelievably hot out here. The National Weather Service issued a warning that starting today through the weekend, there is an extreme heat alert. And they're basically advising people that if you don't have to be outside, don't. If you do, stay in the shade. Be inside if you can, drink plenty of water. I mean, the concern, as with all of these heat waves, is the illness and the death. And as you mentioned, I think people don't have a real appreciation of how much heat waves cause death all over the world. It's the leading weather-related killer when it comes to climate events. The Pacific Northwest heat wave, which we just had that you mentioned, killed hundreds of people. 2 years ago in Europe, many people may not remember, tens of thousands of people died in a heat wave there. Same thing back in 2003. And so this is the ongoing concern that we see more of these events, that more and more people will lose their lives. And it's not like the suffering is spread equally. The elderly, people with certain medical conditions are most likely to die, the homeless, and people who can't choose to work inside, people who don't have adequate housing, and people who can't afford to pay the high cost of running their electricity and their air conditioning day after day.
And William, we know that there is a considerable amount of research being done about the role that climate change is playing in all this. What is known at this point about the connection between the heat and climate change?
That's right, Judy. This whole field of research is known as attribution science. How much can you attribute a given event to something like climate change? And scientists are getting better and better at zeroing in on which events are really driven or impacted heavily by climate change. There was a study just out last week from a European agency that said that the Pacific Northwest heat wave that we all just experienced was almost certainly driven in large part by climate change, that it could not have happened and been as bad without climate change. June, we know, was the hottest June that North America has ever seen in record. Over the last 20 years, the Earth has seen the 19 of the warmest years on record. And so this is what the climate models have always predicted, that climate change keeps going up as we pump more in oil and gas and coal into the atmosphere. Temperatures will go up and these extreme events will go up. These heat waves, the research is showing that they're more frequent now, they are starting earlier, and they are lasting longer. So it is a genuine concern.
And William, given all of this, what can local officials, what can residents do to stay safe?
Well, some of the things that we talked about before, go to cooling centers like the one that I'm standing in front of here in Visalia. The larger issue is, of course, we need to cut our emissions to stop the temperature of the planet going up. But on a more localized level, states and cities and counties, There's good research that's showing that you can design cities better. You can build buildings smarter using better materials, more reflective surfaces. You can plant more trees that offer a lot of shade. Those things are all crucial. One of the most important things that researchers I've talked to have said is that strengthening our electrical grid infrastructure is key. Because right now in Visalia, there's maybe 100,000 people standing around me, living around me, who are protected by the electricity that is fueling their air conditioners. If we had a massive blackout in the middle of one of these massive heat waves, and all of a sudden that is hundreds of thousands of people that would no longer have the protection of that air conditioning, and you could see a real tragic event occur. That's one of the big fears, that as these heat waves become more common, big stresses on the electrical grid can cause real serious problems.
It is such a big story, such a serious concern. William Brangham, thank you, and please stay safe. We hope everyone's able to stay safe. Thanks.
Thanks, Judy.
Congress may be on recess, but there is a long list of priorities on the agenda when they return to Washington. As Lisa Desjardins reports, there's something else making a comeback too, the earmark, an object both relished and reviled that benefits constituents back home.
We start here, Ansonia, Connecticut. Mayor David Cassetti needs a new bridge. This outdated one is a literal roadblock to perhaps Ansonia's greatest asset, an abandoned copper and brass factory. 66 acres of rusting but prime real estate near major highways and waterways, a piece of history from a century ago where now Ansonia sees its future.
We want to build it back up to an economic engine where we could have jobs for our community as well as the surrounding communities. I mean, be thousands of jobs.
A no-nonsense character, Cassetti helped muscle Ansonia's Main Street back to life after years as a near ghost town. But unemployment is still above the national average. Restaurants are hungry for more customers during the day, hoping for a new large employer.
Maybe Google or Amazon or one of the big internet companies.
But first, to get anyone to this potential business site, the city needs a stronger bridge and millions of dollars to build it. Enter the congressional earmark. By definition, an earmark is congressional funding for a specific local project. As old as the nation itself, they've often been pet projects of powerful lawmakers, and at times, scandalous.
An Ohio congressman agreed to plead guilty today to conspiracy and making false statements.
2006, Bob Ney pleaded to corruption, taking money from lobbyist Jack Abramoff in exchange for earmarks for his clients. 1 year before, earmarks for defense contractors brought down Congressman Duke Cunningham, who pleaded guilty to bribery. Some proposed earmarks, like Alaska's so-called Bridge to Nowhere, added to the fury.
The House has made clear in our rules that there will be no earmarks.
In 2011, Republicans running the House decided simply to stop using them. President Obama pushed Senate Democrats to do the same. Earmarks went on pause until this year, when Congress decided to bring them back.
I call this meeting of the Committee on Appropriations to order.
Two House Democrats, Appropriations Chairwoman Rosa DeLauro and Transportation Chairman Peter DeFazio, are leading the effort to put them in the spending bills before Congress now.
Tell me, why bring back earmarks now?
You know, because I think what we're about here is the spending of federal dollars. And I don't believe that anyone knows better about what the issues are in a community than the member who represents that community.
It's about who decides which parks, which roads, and which local projects get federal funds. Right now, that's government agencies. Earmarks would give individual lawmakers some of that power.
Now, earmarks amount to just a fraction of the federal budget, but even so, billions of dollars are on the line. To shake earmarks past, the Appropriations Committee has given them a new brand name, Community Project Funding, and new rules.
Each earmark request must be public. They are posted online, a sea change from years where this was all in secret. each must show community support, and they cannot directly benefit for-profit companies.
We're all playing by the same rules. It's got to meet the guidelines. So for me, I will follow the same guidelines as everyone else.
Transparency is better, but not bringing them back at all would have been the best decision.
Tom Schatz is president of Citizens Against Government Waste. He sees earmarks as a blight, feeding corruption and runaway spending.
There is nothing good about earmarks. It doesn't matter what the project is. The merits are not the issue.
Which is why 105 House members, mostly Republicans, are not requesting any, boycotting the idea. Among them, freshman Byron Donalds.
We don't have any money. Like, we are deficit spending in Washington, D.C.
Donalds has stood his ground as more senior Republicans have told him that earmarks have a long history and can do good.
With all due respect to my colleagues that have been up there longer, I'm here now. And so my job isn't to look at what has always happened.
In truth, most controversial earmarks die on the vine. The bridge to nowhere was withdrawn. A proposed rainforest in Iowa never happened. Lawrence Welk Museum, no earmark. One of the few to make headlines and keep its funding was for this bearded iron statue in Birmingham, Alabama, Vulcan. The century-old symbol of the city's strength and skill was crumbling in 2001 and got a notorious $3.5 million earmark. Happy birthday. But one person's boondoggle is another's joy. The statue, which turned 117 in May, and the park that blossomed around it are significant draws in Birmingham. 1,000 miles away, that's the dream in Ansonia, Connecticut.
I want to bring it back to the heyday that it once was with a twist of the 21st century.
Yes. Mayor Cassetti has a vision and luck.
I stood with Mayor Cassetti in Ansonia at the Ansonia Copper and Brass.
His Congress member is Rosa DeLauro, the appropriations chair restarting earmarks, and Ansonia's new bridge is on her list. The Republican mayor defends this cross-party alliance.
She knows that it's in need. I mean, we can't just let them sit idle like they have been for the last 20 years. Something needs to happen.
Multiply Ansonia's story by 5,000. That's how many projects have been requested as earmarks so far. While critics grit their teeth, lawmakers are now deciding not if, but which projects like this make it into spending bills. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Lisa Desjardins.
And now we turn to the analysis of Brooks and Tumulty. That's New York Times columnist David Brooks and Karen Tumulty, deputy opinion editor for the Washington Post. Jonathan Capehart is away. It is so good to see both of you on this Friday. But let's pick up, David, with that really wonderful report from Lisa Desjardins, walk down memory lane, at least in Washington. Earmarks coming back, a good thing or not?
Good thing. I miss them. They were so romantic. First, earmarks allow leadership to pass bills because they can offer recalcitrant members this or that, your bridge, and so they aid passing bills. They make Congress less polarized because it becomes more transactional rather than just the ideology. They take power. When we got rid of earmarks, they didn't go away. They just went to the executive branch. So some guy sitting or man or woman sitting in the Department of Transportation made the decision, not Congress, and it was even more hidden. And then getting rid of earmarks had nothing to do with federal spending. They're, as Lisa said, they're a tiny, tiny part of the budget, but the money just moved, and it still went out the door. And so there was no decrease in federal deficit. So on every measure, getting rid of earmarks, like most reforms, I would add, was a mistake.
A mistake, Karen?
I think so, too. It was an understandable reaction to the Jack Abramoff scandal, which was one of the worst to hit Washington in decades. But I think earmarks are also a way that people feel connected to their government. They can point to tangible things in their community that are there because they matter to people in that community, so that members of Congress can then say, this is why you sent me to Washington. And yes, the Appropriations Committee, where all these deals were done, was one of the last bastions of bipartisanship on Capitol Hill.
And so speaking of that, I mean, this argument, David, that this is going to bring back bipartisanship, but the argument on the other side that, yeah, it may do that, but it's also going to bring back corruption and wheeling and dealing that's we don't need.
They're both true. I mean, there is corruption involved, and it's something that goes to powerful people. You can drive through West Virginia, and you get the Robert Byrd Highway off to the Robert Byrd exit to the Robert Byrd Hospital. So, you know, you get powerful people do get to control things, and it's not totally fair. But you're measuring it against some Platonic system where there's this bipartisan, non-biased set of judges who decide objectively where a road should be put in. That does not exist in a democracy. We have a democratic process, and this is a reasonably democratic way to go about where these little bits of funding will go or not go.
And also, decision-making is less hyper-ideological. Its politics has become so nationalized that I think that is really one of the problems with our system now.
Well, it's fascinating to watch it come back, and we'll see where it goes. I want to bring up with both of you what President Trump spent a good bit of time talking about this week,
Biden.
David. And that's
President
did
Biden.
I say President
Trump?
Okay, President Biden. Thank you. Spent time talking about this week, and that is his decision to pull U.S. troops out of Afghanistan now. He made the argument again, David, this is the right thing to do. The Afghan leaders ought to be able to run their own country. Is it the right decision?
I think he's making a mistake, you know, and it's become obvious in record time that it's a mistake. When he announced the policy initially, he said he had faith in the Afghan government to hold Afghanistan together from the Taliban. That has fallen apart. We reported earlier on the show, 85% of the territory has already fallen to the Taliban. The Taliban seems completely confident they will take over. And, you know, we all, I think it was 2014 or so, when this Pakistani young lady, Malala, won the Nobel Prize, and who was shot in the head by the Taliban for going to school. There are a lot of Afghan Malalas out there. And we were all moved by her, and we all sympathized and thought that was a very important cause, that young women in this part of the world should be able to get an education. And we're walking away from that. We're walking away from the idea that Afghanistan will stay one country. We could be walking away from the idea that we can keep al-Qaeda out of Afghanistan again. So they could set up a terror spot. You could just get incredible turmoil in that part of the world, refugees flooding into Pakistan, destabilizing Pakistan. So to me, what we were doing over the last year, which was like 2,500 troops, relatively low casualties, was a price worth paying for humanitarian and strategic reasons. And I think it's a mistake that we're pulling out.
How do you see it?
I think that President Biden is very much where the American people are here. Democrats, Republicans, independents, as testy as this exchange got with reporters yesterday, the fact is Joe Biden was a skeptic of a broader mission in Afghanistan. When he was vice president, he was a sort of lone voice in the Obama White House on this. But he believes this is one of the things that he was elected to do, and it's where he has been for over a decade, and increasingly, it is absolutely where the American people are.
And David, this argument that the president has made repeatedly, and that is how many more young American women and men is the United States going to send there to either to die, to be wounded, to experience tour of duty after tour of duty.
Right, and everybody honors those who serve, and nobody takes their sacrifice lightly. But they're not in combat roles primarily. We haven't had many casualties at all in the last year. They're mostly in training and support roles. But even in those roles, they seem to have enough influence, along with the other NATO troops, to keep the country by Afghanistan's standards, relatively stable. And so to me, it's a trade-off worth making, like any other use of force around the world that America's ever done. We weigh the benefits and the costs, and I think it's worth the cost. But what Karen says is absolutely true. The country is sick of all this. And I worry about that a little. I understand the exhaustion with the forever war. But America has been, in the post-war era, the superpower. And we have gone in and stabilized places. We've done a lot, made horrible mistakes in Vietnam and Iraq, obviously. But we've kept troops in Germany for a reason. We've kept troops in Korea for a reason. We've kept troops. And are we going to continue to play that role or not? We're clearly going to scale it back. How much? Even the story earlier in the program on Haiti. If Haiti's asking us to come in to stabilize Haiti, is that our role anymore? It used to be, you had some sense of where America's posture was. I don't think I have a sense of where America's posture is right now.
And as much as President Biden says he doesn't want to be in the business of nation building, you look at what's going on in Haiti, you look at in Central America, where strengthening these countries is the administration's strategy to getting control of the border. The fact is, every president says they don't want to get into nation building, and every president ends up having to do it.
But a lot of lives lost, lives changed, money spent in that country. Bringing it back home, New York City had its primary elections a couple of weeks ago. We now know who the Democratic winner is. He's Eric Adams. David, former police captain, not the most progressive, not the most liberal in the race, and he only won by, 1 percentage point. But what does it say that he won, given his background?
Well, you know, it used to be you could tell how somebody was going to vote by their income levels. That's less predictable now. It's education levels. And so the Democratic Party, the way this shows up is you have sort of 3 wings of the Democratic Party, and it showed up in the presidential, and it's interesting to me it showed up in New York just the same. You've got the more moderate African-American, Latino, some whites, moderate whites, and they tend to go for the Joe Biden, Eric Adams candidate, who's more moderate. Then you've got the young, college-educated professionals. They tend to go further left. They went to Maya Wiley. And then you've got the upscale, little older professionals who go for the candidates the New York Times endorses, which in this case with Catherine Garcia. And so the good government candidate. And so it's interesting that these 3 demographic groups pick 3 different kinds of candidates, and it happened in the presidential race. It's happening in New York. I imagine it'll happen in other Democratic races.
Of course, this is a good news, bad news thing for Eric Adams. Congratulations, you won. Now you have to be mayor of New York. But I do think that this also was the biggest experiment that we have seen yet in ranked choice voting, where you don't have to just pick a candidate. You can express your preferences. And as much as the New York City Board of Elections tried to screw this up, it worked the way it was supposed to, which is that the coalition building candidate who could sort of reach beyond a narrow slice of the electorate won. And so now he's got to deal with what appears to be the primary issue on people's minds in New York City, which is crime.
And is this sending a message, though, David, to come back to the question about he's not the most progressive candidate. He's not for defunding the police. In fact, far from it. Does it send a message to Democrats more broadly?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the most vocal part of the Democratic Party is the college-educated younger people who are more left-wing than the party. And if you go on my Twitter feed with all my progressive friends, there's not many pro-Biden people on my Twitter feed. They're all further left. And so the Democratic Party has to remember that basically America and even the Democratic Party is not the Upper West Side. It's not Soho. It's not the West Village. It's Canarsie. It's Bed-Stuy. It's Sunnyside in Queens. It's the South Bronx. And those are places where, A, they're actually sending their kids to public schools, so they actually care quite a lot. B, it's not as safe as the Upper West Side. And so they're dealing with crime. And so the party has to remember that real life is not Twitter. Real life is not even the activist base. That's something all parties have to remember. And this election is a reminder of that.
Wait a minute, real life is not Twitter. But Karen, does it send, is this just a New York City unique story, or does it send a message of some kind to other Democrats?
Normally, I would say be very, very careful about taking anything from New York City politics and trying to apply it nationwide. But in this case, you talk to Democratic leaders all over the country. They are very, very nervous about how the issue of violent crime is going to play for their party in what was already shaping up to be an incredibly difficult midterm election season.
And we see President Biden wrestling with that right now. He's had a couple of conversations about it, and David, we understand he's going to be having more to say about it next week.
Yeah, and of course it's an issue he has long and a controversial past about.
For sure, for sure. We are so glad to see the two of you, David Brooks, Karen Tumulty. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great to be here.
Thank you. Finally tonight, we couldn't finish this week without recognizing history made at the National Spelling Bee last night and the impressive young teen who won it. Lisa Desjardins is back with her story.
The word is Maria.
A genus of trees. That was the word that sealed her victory last night.
Murraya.
That is correct.
14-year-old Zaila Avant-Garde from Harvey, Louisiana, became the first African-American to win the Scripps National Spelling Bee.
I've been working on it for 2 years, and then to finally have it, the best possible outcome was it was really good.
The only previous black champion was an international student from Jamaica, Jody Ann Maxwell, in 1998.
I'm hoping that in a few years, I'll see a whole lot more African-American females and males too doing well in the Scripps Spelling Bee, because it's a really good thing. It kind of is a good gate opener to being interested in education.
For Avant-Garde, competitive spelling came relatively late in her life, only 2 years ago, with daily study sessions about 7 hours long, reviewing nearly 13,000 words a day.
I just study it, getting ready for Scripps.
This summer, she emerged from more than 200 contestants and breezed to victory past 10 other finalists last night. It was a stark contrast to the previous competition in 2019, when 8 students took home a prize.
The 2021 Scripps National Spelling Bee champion.
But for Avant-Garde, winning the bee and the $50,000 that came with it is only one of her passions. She is also an avid basketball player and the owner of 3 Guinness World Records for her amazing dribbling skills. With her basketball talents and now the spelling bee under her belt, she says she now has her eyes set on even more ambitious goals, from playing in the WNBA to maybe one day coaching in the NBA. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Lisa Desjardins.
All we can say is, wow, this young woman is headed, to the Olympics and to the White House. We'll see. And on the NewsHour online right now, our Friday 5 stories tell you about a sports car that can fly, why 4-day work weeks work, and other stories you may have missed. You can find that on our YouTube channel or on our website. That's pbs.org/NewsHour 5 stories. And stay with PBS. Yamiche Alcindor gets a live report from Haiti in this moment of crisis. And her panel dissects the latest into the probe into the January 6th insurrection. That's tonight on Washington Week. And keep watching PBS Tonight to catch the final episode of Season 2 of Beyond the Canvas. It showcases the vibrant arts world in Mexico.
On Beyond the Canvas, we witness how Mexican culture is enjoying a global renaissance.
Mexico is definitely a country of contrast. It's happening, it's alive.
Art, it's part of our reality. It's good for us to think about doing films in Mexico.
For me, it means that I'm giving a voice and visibility. I enjoy fighting for my Indigenous community because I feel proud of who I am.
Join host Amna Nawaz tonight at 10:30 p.m. Please check your local listings. And you won't want to miss our 5-part series, Raising the Future. Each night next week, we explore one of the most critical issues facing families, childcare. Here's a look.
Essential for families everywhere, but for many, out of reach.
Our childcare landscape is broken.
One major issue, cost.
If I worked, I would be working to pay childcare.
A fragile system laid bare by the pandemic.
What happens when there's not enough childcare?
It's going to be a moment of reckoning.
Sparking a national debate which could impact families for generations to come. Raising the Future, America's Childcare Dilemma, starting Monday night on the PBS NewsHour.
The issues don't get any more important than that one. And that's the NewsHour for tonight. I'm Judy Woodruff. Thank you. Please stay safe and have a good weekend.